time for something different today. Not something different, actually. Two things different. And these are great little projects to use with either a dip pen or a fountain pen. So we're going to be doing one with a dip pen and one with a fountain pen. And I'm going to talk you through why you might use a dip pen, why you might use a fountain pen, and also just having fun with our pens and ink for, perhaps Inktober, which is the time of year it is at the moment. I'm using my Etcher sketchbook here, nice A5 cold pressed paper. Really takes watercolours well, but also takes ink lines really nicely as well. So first, we're starting off with our dip pen, and if you have seen me before, you'll know that I'm starting with step one. For all my sketches, step one is about finding those key little shapes. Now, the dip pen is basically a very similar feel to a fountain pen. It's got a flexible nib, the ink sort of flows down to the tip in the same way. The difference, of course, being you dip it instead of having a fountain of ink that's coming out of the pen itself. It doesn't have a reservoir. The reservoir is these little pots. There's a few advantages which come with that dip pen then. Number one, it's cheaper. It's not such a sort of fabulous contraption. It doesn't need so much workmanship. So you can pick up a dip pen for £2 or £3, and you can then pick up loads of different nibs for a pound or two each. You can get spoon nibs, you can get long nibs, fine nibs, fat nibs, calligraphy nibs. You can get all sorts. I'm just using a sort of fairly standard but very flexible nib here. Far more flexible than any fountain pen I've ever used. And that lets us immediately create these bold lines, which are forming the outside, really fine hatching, which is coming underneath the awning of this cafe, and also work on little details like all these people sat and stood outside the front of the cafe. So that's one really key advantage of a dip pen, because it's cheap. You can be flexible, you can get all sorts of different nibs, you can create all sorts of different lines. The other thing is we can use all sorts of different inks. Now, in theory, any ink is safe to use in a dip pen. In reality, although they're all safe, thicker inks tend to be better because it's not flowing through the pen. Instead, it needs to cling to that pen when we dip it and gradually sort of drip down onto the nib. Or at least that is my understanding of the sort of physics of what's going on here. That means we can use those more traditional inks like India ink. So I've got a couple of pots of Winsor Newton India ink that I'm using for this sketch. India ink is not waterproof, but it has some water resistance when it's dried. It's actually okay, I find, to add watercolours on top. You can, of course, get totally waterproof inks, and they'd be safe to use in your fountain pen, unlike a lot of waterproof inks, which are not totally safe to use in our fountain pens. So we've got the flexibility of having different inks, not being bound to unsafe inks, not having to buy special expensive inks. So loads more flexibility at a lower price point. There are, of course, always going to be downsides to the upsides. Now, we've talked a lot about the positives of dip pens, how fun they are to use and things like that. But let's move on to the negatives so you can understand why you might not want to use them. You might have seen a few times my line runs out, goes dry. Well, fine. So I have to go and pick up a bit more ink. I can't do my lovely, what I think is lovely continuous line drawing. Instead, I have to focus more on specific mark making, specific shapes. It lends to a slightly more rigid style of art than I would normally do. But that's no bad thing, to sort of stretch and change myself to adapt to what I have to do. And for many of you, you probably don't like my really loose and wobbly lines. So having a pen which allows you or forces you to be a bit more strict, probably not a bad thing. The other disadvantage is if you want to sketch outside, obviously with a lot of other pens where they have their own reservoir, you just sit down and you do it. But with a dip pen, you need somewhere to put that ink bottle. And if that ink bottle spills, you got a mess. If it spills on you, you might well have a very permanent mess on you or on your clothes. So there are disadvantages compared to other pens. Perhaps they're more flexible at home, but less flexible to take around outside. But you can see they are very lovely pens, creating a great range of marks, really being able to create these bold lines now, having created lots of very fine lines, being able to black in areas, create real areas of contrast, and all with a very, very cheap and fun bit of equipment. So we've now almost finished our little ink sketch here. And I know what you're thinking. A bit boring, isn't it? Well, we've got different inks. And this is the other bit of magic about dip pens. You can literally just use the same pen and immediately add some colour. And you can do it in fun ways. So you could, bring out a brush and you could basically paint with this ink if you wanted, or you could add watercolours on top. Or we can stick with what's magic about dip pens, magic about ink, which is their quality of line. And I'm just using a lovely orange ink. Again, this one is made by Winsor Newton. I've just got a little set of different colours. I think they call this one apricot, but I could be making that up. Nonetheless, it's just one of their standard run-of-the-mill tinted or coloured India inks. And we can apply this kind of hatching. This hatching shows we've got something, but it also does this kind of paradoxical thing of applying texture whilst flattening an area. What I mean is you're showing that there is texture, there is ink lines, they're creating texture, but also it flattens that sky and it pushes forward some of the other aspects, like that key little cafe that we spent a little while sketching. Now I've swapped over to a lovely pink ink. I can't even remember what they call this one, but it's a lovely, well, pinky purple, isn't it? And now we just use another colour to suggest a different layer. So by applying this colour in front on these cafes, on these people, in the back we've got this kind of mid-ground from the hatching, which is flattening everything. Then hopefully at the front, by blotting in and by filling in some colours like the heads, we're kind of going, you know what, this is right at the front. This is why the colours are saturated. And then just having a little play with some other features of hatching, pulling apart different parts of this image. And there we go. That's my little how-to, very simple how-to, little dip pen project that you might want to have a go with this Inktober or, well, any time of year. And now let's have a go with fountain pens. So we all probably know fountain pens. I've done polls on my channel before, and most, not the vast majority, but more than 50% of people have a fountain pen as their preferred sketching implement. And that is probably biased because I use fountain pens a lot on my channel. So I'm probably drawing in you guys who also like fountain pens. Now, why are fountain pens great? Well, they are flexible compared to the sort of standard ballpoints or fine liners. The nibs are flexible. Here I'm using a bit of a silly pen. This is a Namiki pen, which has a gold nib. It's a medium nib, but gold nibs are super flexible. So I'm going to be able to create not quite as much variability as a dip pen, but a lot of variability nonetheless. The other key advantage compared to dip pens is that obviously it's got a reservoir of ink. So either you can buy ink converters, you can buy ink cartridges, or lots of pens like this one, like TWSBI pens, and like pens made by Noodlers. They have their own ink reservoir, which can actually carry 2 or 3 mils of ink. So my TWSBI, which is the pen I use most often on this channel, for example, I can sketch almost for a month using that and not have to refill it. There are waterproof inks as well that you can use, and I have videos about waterproof inks. The disadvantage with fountain pens is that you need to care for them, and that is basically using them regularly, preventing them drying out by keeping the lid on, and if you're not going to be using it, then you need to wash out that ink, particularly for pens which are valuable sentimentally or financially that you don't want to get blocked. But on the other hand, what you also have with the fountain pen is this amazing bit of equipment which will last years and years and years and years and years and years, that you'll get to know that you will be part of your style, part of how you draw, sketch, write. And that, I think, is something that really you can't really measure. That's not something you can do a review on and pop a 5-minute video up on. But with a fountain pen, you are getting that amazing sort of knowledge, that combined learning where you work together. Again, I love sketching with my fountain pen. I love sketching and using marks which show what I'm doing. So here we've got lots of ideas of hatching, creating those textures which are simulating the shadow in our lovely cliffs. But whilst they are simulating the shadow, they're also showing how we've done it. They're showing that this is a pen sketch. Unlike trying to create a photorealistic oil painting or a photorealistic acrylic or creating a loose watercolour, we can tell this is an ink sketch just from the texture, just from the way the marks are made. It's not a pencil sketch. It's not done with fine lines from anything except a pen. And I think that is a really lovely part of ink sketching. And we can again take these ideas and expand them. So let's create some fun in the sky. I want to perhaps show the idea of a cloud. So before we did some simple hatching in the sky. And this time I'm going to do some more sort of contour sketching. I'm starting off very loose, and I actually regret how loose this is. Or at least I regretted it until I fixed it. It doesn't fit. The rest of the image is quite tight and quite neat. So I can go back. As long as you start loose and you're gentle, you'll be able to quote unquote fix things. And that, again, when we're talking about the advantages of different types of pens, that's a key advantage to fountain pens, particularly fountain pens which are nice and flexible, which give you this huge range and variety of lines. You can create soft lines, and then you can make those soft lines almost disappear by creating bolder, more specific lines on top. And that's what I'm doing with this sort of contour line of the cloud. Imagine an OS map, a walking map, where all the mountains are visible because you're drawing those contour lines going round it, showing the altitude. You can do the same things with objects in your sketches, and that again is showing off the process of the sketch. Again, we can flatten out that sky, and I actually spend a good length of time doing this and thinking, how can I make this tighter? How can I remove some of that distraction from those looser lines? Well, I can double up the lines, and that's going to make them feel more dense, more specific, more compact. And hopefully you'll agree that it kind of pushes forward by flattening out this area. It both pushes forward that cloud, which is more interesting than these flat lines, and it pushes forward the mountains, the cliffs, which are certainly more interesting than these flat lines. Now, something to be aware of with ink sketching is the ability to certainly overdo things. When we have added a lot of ink in one place, we might have relatively overdone that area, and we need to be careful to make sure that the key things are still standing out. And again, the flexibility afforded you by a fountain pen, and to a lesser extent by a dip pen, in being able to blot out areas like this means that I can actually create some very bold lines. I want these bold lines to simplify things. There's so much noise going on that I need a really simple edge, something which catches the eye and goes, look, here is the interesting bit. Everything above here is less interesting. I could do a similar thing below using a bit of hatching, complete those linear lines in the sky, coming down below that arch, and we're done. So there you go, a little bit of waffling about different kinds of pens. If you've enjoyed that, please subscribe and check out my courses on sketchloose.co.uk.